So now it's my pleasure to welcome Tony, co-founder, CEO of DoorDash. Before he started DoorDash with several colleagues he met at business school and undergrad, Tony was either crazy enough or dumb enough to intern at Square. He disregarded my advice and went to GSB anyway. But before GSB, he graduated with a degree in industrial engineering from Berkeley, worked at McKinsey, somehow navigated a way to be doing special projects for the CEO of eBay, had a little exposure to venture, which actually probably was useful in raising money initially. So Tony, come join us on stage to talk about a lot of interesting topics. So when you started DoorDash, there was a lot of people kind of doing delivery directly, indirectly. There were other startups. There was this Grubhub thing. Restaurants, pizza, often deliver themselves. Why did you think that the world needed something better, different, and that you could possibly deliver it?
Well, I mean, I don't think it started with our thinking that we could do it. But I mean, one of the things that we realized was everyone was telling us how competitive and saturated delivery was, and the market was, you're right, I mean, there were at least 20 companies at the time. And that's just counting the venture fund ones. But one of the things that at least we saw early on was that delivery was actually not very well served. Outside of New York City, outside of Chicago, maybe some parts of Boston, and outside of a couple of cuisine categories, pizza and Chinese food, I mean, basically no one offered delivery. So there were 1 million restaurants in America, yet about 15 to 17,000 of them offered delivery. Our question was, why did the rest not? And that was really, the big question for us all along, and probably why we thought that there was a chance.
And what was your conclusion when you sort of studied the market and you tested it out and worked with restaurants, called them up, et cetera? What was your conclusion of the why?
Yeah, I think there were a few things. I mean, our biggest question was, we always had 3 questions, but the biggest question was always, consumers probably just didn't want this. Otherwise, it would have existed. This is not a very new idea. It's been around since, horses or whatever preceded horses have been around. And so, so that was the biggest fear we had. The second big fear or risk that we were trying to take away was restaurants. That one was a lot easier. I mean, I kind of grew up working inside of a Chinese restaurant, so I kind of knew that there's no chance, even if you're the Domino's of the world, that you could do delivery. And it's not because you're not good at math or you don't like engineering or any of this sort of stuff. It's mostly because the structure is this peak demand problem where you're always either you have too many drivers or too few drivers. And so it makes a lot more sense if you could take a group of drivers and then just give them to wherever there is demand and not have to use any when you don't have any demand. So that one was more understandable. So then the leftover question was really, will drivers actually want to do this? And is there a way to recruit all of these drivers? And I do think that was a bit of this why now question, where prior I drove for a few services like Domino's at the time. The way you drive for a Domino's in 2013 was you check in through paper and you check out through paper, right? You literally on a clipboard right when you signed in and you sign out on the same table. I mean, that was the kind of technology in quotes of what was behind the app or the web interface in terms of like how drivers are routed or checked in or checked out. And obviously there are better ways to do that given where mobile was in the years preceding.
How soon did you know you were on the right track?
Probably 4 years maybe into the journey. I mean, because the question you never know as the entrepreneur is how big is the market, right? That's the really lucky or the unlucky part, I think. There's elements of skill, of course, but then the lucky or the unlucky part that's hard to control entirely as an entrepreneur is, how much can you actually influence consumers or enterprises to change their behavior? And I think it was when we started getting outside of what I call the NFL cities or the Major League Baseball cities, and it started working just as well. That was one data point. The other data point was, we always had, and even to this day, we always had as many households who earned below the national wage average. At that time, it was $48,000. If you adjust for all the inflation stuff, it's closer to $58,000 today. So as many households underneath that benchmark as we had over that benchmark ordering equally every single month. And I think those two data points were when, when I had enough conviction that like, okay, this is going to work everywhere.
So in the 4 years in the interim, how do you motivate the team? How do you keep people like excited where you have like your own personal doubts that this is really on the right track?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with trying to find the right people. Because I think if you always have to, go uphill, I think that's pretty tough. And one of the things you want to do, especially when you're, I don't know where everyone in the audience is, but if you're the earlier stage you are, time is really against you. And so, try not, if you didn't have to motivate someone who was not motivated, then you could avoid that path, right? And so we tended to hire quite a lot of these competitive types. So when I looked back, out of our first maybe 300 people at the company, that would have been the first 5 years of the company's life, maybe about 120 of them, so almost 40%, played some competitive activity. That could be defined as sports, which was measured, by people who at least at D1 all the way up to the Olympics. It could have been the best cellist. It could have been the best wrestler. It could have been the best, piano player. We tended to go for that type. And that was true across functions. So even for engineering, we didn't necessarily go after those who wanted to, I guess today, invent AGI. We more went after people, engineers who were very comfortable doing deliveries, for example, on a Friday night, which is not every type of engineer in Silicon Valley, especially when there are a lot of offers being thrown at them at the time. And so those are the two types of groups. And so motivating a group that already is motivated is a lot more efficient and easier to do than trying to always sell uphill. That's one. Two, we were very transparent. So it was a very high accountability kind of place. Every week, even when the cash balance would run down to weeks left, we would show the cash balance every single week, right? And that takes a certain environment to be able to do that. But if you recruit people who I think are very ambitious, high accountability to themselves, they're going to see through the bullshit pretty fast. And so I think if you can marry that with a culture that is already authentic to who they are, or 80% who they are, I think that leads to a lot of credibility. And then the final thing is, you have to show them a plan forward. Especially when times are tough, and we had lots of tough years, as you know. I mean, 16, 17, 18, I raised exactly $0. When all of our competitors raised a lot more dollars. And those were difficult years. And obviously the cash balance was going in one direction at the time. And I think showing them literally like what the inputs that were in our control were, whether it was on the product or fundraising or how we were doing in a way that was like true, and not trying to manufacture certain facts, but true, I think helped quite a lot in getting people to continue to have the conviction. I mean, there were losses. We took, we had losses of people through those years, but by and large, I would say 80-ish% of the team stuck together.
So in addition to the transparency, what were the other key early cultural tenets?
It was a very truth-seeking place, and so even to this day, it's a place where we're always, trying to just find truth. It's very easy to try to look for things that confirm an opinion or prove that you're successful, especially when you're running out of cash. You're looking for a lot of positive signals, but it was a very truth-seeking place. We taught everyone SQL, for example, including our customer support team members who can pull their own data and their own queries. That also led to a place that shipped quite quickly. So it was a place that generally, if there was a morning like, I don't know, sync, things would be done by the afternoon. And then we just rinse and repeat that process Monday through Sunday, during those early years. And that was just, a big place for that. It was a place that had very high accountability, but low blame or no blame. So we didn't fire people like when experiments didn't work. For new projects, especially when by definition there's a high likelihood of failure, we didn't demote someone if we put our best people on some of these new projects. That's what I mean by low blame but high accountability. And I think the final thing I'd probably say is it was a place that, and it still is. I mean, we try to make it a place that's more about the substance and less about the perception of things. So we didn't necessarily listen to a lot of PR or podcasting or all the stuff in the ether, which was very negative during those years. I think about our industry and about our company, but it was a place very much based on what did the customer say, whether that was a consumer, a merchant, a dasher. So it was a place that cared a lot about the substance.
What percentage of your time did you spend hiring?
In the early days, it was probably up to half. So that was, I mean, I would be the recruiter, so we couldn't afford a lot of what I call scaffolding or support functions at the time because we were just always broke. And so I would be doing my LinkedIn homework, in the morning or in the wee hours, and then I would be doing my cold emails and cold calls, throughout the day, or have those scheduled to be sent through email. And then obviously interviews and flying to meet people and all these sorts of things.
What was your best advantage in assessing people, like when you actually interviewed people?
I think the earliest hires, we tended to bias them towards some of these beliefs, whether it was a bias for action or a very high accountability type person. So mostly it was, we didn't have I don't believe in these silver bullet interview questions that can tease out things. I mean, I think the 2 or maybe 3 things that really worked for us. One, we had a type of question that was quite surprising to candidates, where I think we had a lot of folks who used to run cities for us, Chicago, Charlotte, San Francisco, et cetera. And they come from generally very well-practiced backgrounds. So they're very good at case studies, they're very good at analysis. But our interview, when they would come in to meet with me as the final interview would be, I'd give them basically 20 minutes to ask me anything they want, and the prompt was, you have the next 8 hours to go acquire 100 customers, and here's $20, and here's also a plane ticket in case you want to quit the interview, because I understand that this may not be what you signed up for, but this is what it's going to feel like on most days where you have no idea what to do, and you're just going to have to do something about it. And if there was a silver bullet question, that probably was one that told quite a lot. I think, though, things over time as we've gotten, a bit bigger, and the types of people we look for are less individual contributors, more leaders. The things we tended to go for were backdoor checks. I mean, every hire that I've made, I probably do at least 20 to 25 backdoor checks. And mostly it's because I'm trying to get a 360 view of really what types of environment they're going to be successful. Every leader is going to be an amazing talker. I promise you that. That's their #1 job, is to communicate. So they're going to talk really, really good. And so whether it's their skip levels or their peers, that's really going to get you a holistic picture of what types of environment they're going to be successful in. It doesn't. I mean, you can have amazing leaders who will be successful in environment A but not B. And then the final one is just listening. Yeah, what I ultimately learned was that, for our 6 attributes of excellence, which is, one thing that we kind of were able to distill our culture into 6 operating principles, it was more not which question we can ask about each principle would we get a great answer. It was more listening for the evidence. So a few examples. Our second CFO, which is now our current president, one of our principles is operating at the lowest level of detail. He showed up to a coffee chat that I think neither of us actually wanted to have, but we were both suggested to have, with a 10 megabyte file model of what DoorDash's future could look like in 7 years. I'm like, I haven't even built this, Christopher Payne, our first president, he retired in 2023. he had all these big jobs on a sheet of paper, right? He reported to Jeff Bezos at Amazon, running e-commerce things. He reported to Gates for a while, running a lot of things for Bing. He worked at eBay, running North America. And after maybe a 2-hour discussion with me about our logistics algorithm, he actually just goes home that night. It's like 4 hours after the interview on a Friday night, and takes his son out, Andrew, and they just go delivering for like 4 hours. I didn't ask him without prompting. If you talk about a bias for action, that's a bias for action. And then the next morning, he writes me like a 2,000-word email about how our logistics algorithm sucks. And so I mean, like, but those are the like types of examples. So listening, I found, is a much better tell of what someone's superpower is going to be versus here's the perfect question. Maybe in the early days and maybe for individual contributors, you can have something that's a lot closer to that. But I think as time has gone on, I've had to learn other techniques.
How long did you continue interviewing every person who got hired?
I approved every offer probably up to like 3,000 or 4,000 people. So I looked for the packets and just, by the way, the main, I know it sounds kind of intense, but the main incentive that you drive there is just knowing that you, the founder CEO, are going to review the packet, in my opinion, increases the bar for rigor. And because I'm always going to ask the question, name me the 75% of the team that this person is better than. You have to literally write out people's names. That's a tough question to answer over and again. But I think interview probably 1,000 people, something like that.
Would you, with the benefit of hindsight, would you recommend that to founders here?
I probably overdid it, but I don't have the counterfactual to tell you what else I would have done with my time, so it's hard to give you the, but what I would say is that getting the team right is worth a very disproportionate amount. I don't know what it is in the grand scheme of things in terms of this pie chart contributing towards your success, but I would imagine it's more than half. At the end of the day, every problem is going to be some set of people that are going to go and solve it for you. You're going to be rate limited by these people, or your company will scale to 10x, depending on who some of these people are.
So one of the bigger challenges that you confronted was a larger, more well-funded potential competitor, actual competitor. Many people obviously are taking on incumbents in the industry that's larger, better financials, et cetera. Any lessons from that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is you have to have the right mindset, which is that you're not going to climb Mount Everest or build Rome, whatever analogy you want, overnight. And so the way to think about this is really a sequencing game where the name of the game is to improve your position. You need to know what the end game is. Like, for example, right, like DoorDash, our goal was never restaurant delivery. The goal was to connect every local business with every local consumer. And we thought an important asset to do that was last mile logistics and building the highest quality, the lowest cost network. And to do that, you need really order density. And in order to get order density, you need coverage of stores and you need high frequency of activity. So if you looked at every category of local retail, restaurants had the highest count of stores. It's about 1 million restaurants, rough math, in America versus, say, 150,000 grocery stores as a counterexample. And so if you can, serve all of those stores and, correctly get them to the highest frequency, which turned out to be a good bet, then you can actually achieve this, right? That was like one step of the DoorDash plan. And it took us 9 years to get to that step. But then from that step, we can work backwards and say, okay, what are the different points to improve our position? So, you need a few things, right? One, strategically, you can't compete against an incumbent on their territory. You're going to lose. So you have to find something where they're either not incentivized to do it, innovator's dilemma, right, where it's lower margin. Some of the incumbents never wanted to touch the end-to-end delivery because it is lower margin than just having to not deal with the delivery. And you have to, find an area where you think you can be advantaged. And for us, it always made more sense to us to deliver actually outside of city centers, which I think for a lot of others, it was almost the opposing view. And the reason for us was actually really simple. It's because it's where everyone lives. If you look at the Bay Area, San Francisco is maybe 5 to 7% of the population. Everyone else lives outside of San Francisco. We were just talking about where Keith's new home is, permanent home is, Miami. Everyone thinks South Beach, Miami. That's about 4% of the population, maybe less. Maybe not on a Saturday night or something, but like in general. And so knowing where the market is and knowing structurally why that's different and why that may be difficult for a competitor to serve, that's pretty important. Now, you also have to be correct on that bet, meaning that yes, it improved our position to go, but we also had the belief that it was where the market was going to be. It turned out to be correct. Now, that was a bet. We didn't know that a priori, so it wasn't some, fait accompli that, a priori, but it improved our position. So strategically, you do have to find, ground where you can compete, where your incumbents are not incentivized or not structurally well set up to do that. The second thing I would say is, operationally, you have to be super fast. And the good news is, as a startup, focus is actually really easy, because you only have one product probably. You don't have this quote unquote capital allocation decision that I think a lot of schools or books would teach about CEOs and what the job of the CEO is. Your capital allocation decision is super easy. You got to build that one product. And you got to point all the team towards the position that you're next going to. And look, you're going to have multiple positions, right? And DoorDash, just to get to that last mile logistics network position in restaurant delivery, we had probably 7 or 8 steps. And it was just going through that and breaking it down. And each step, the only thing is it helped improve our position. That was the way I was. And then the final thing you have to do is, ideally, you have a team. And one of the reasons why we looked for athletes early on, or looked for people in competitive fields, or who have pursued something very difficult in their life, it could have been in school or extracurriculars, is because they've kind of seen failure and that it's going to take many years before they can be experts or successful at some adventure. So we had the group ready, for the tough moments where, you're not making the progress that you hoped you would have made, or there's some big announcement, that I don't know, some competitor made, or something bad were to happen, that, that the boat would still be relatively intact, so that you can keep building position.
You also had an insight, though, that there's sort of like a secret in a certain sense, which is that the driver network for larger entities was not really an advantage, might even be a disadvantage.
Yeah, so like back to this idea that strategically you can't compete against somebody on their home ground. We never would have started DoorDash if the same people delivering people were the same people delivering burritos. We never would have even started the company. That was, and one of the early insights we had actually was just a very simple, not scientific experiment where we recruited 20 DoorDash drivers and 20 UberX drivers. At the time, they both earned about $20 an hour in Palo Alto. And we just made an offer, $25 an hour, a guaranteed offer to switch jobs. Uber come to DoorDash, DoorDash go to Uber, and only one driver said yes. 1 out of 2 groups of 20, so 1 out of 40 said yes. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that something strange is happening. And what was strange, and it should have been obvious to me, but in hindsight, is that they were just fundamentally very different people. More than half of DoorDash's drivers are women. We tend to cater to a much younger crowd. The average DoorDash driver does 3 hours a week. We have more drivers than any other service in the US combined, actually, in alternate services. Not because we're so great or anything, but mainly because, the type of work that we offer truly is the part-time opportunity of the century. And 90% of them do it fewer than 10 hours a week. And so I think that early insight gave us enough confidence that this would be a quite unique driver supply pool.
Which obviously turned out to be the case. Last question from me, and then we'll take a couple from the audience, is You mentioned that the original vision of DoorDash always included it was always transcended, like, let's say, food delivery. But you did tackle the most difficult problem first, which is hot food reliably delivered from a wide selection. Was it conscious that we want to bite off the hardest challenge first, or it just happened to be that was the hardest problem?
Yeah, it was very intentional. And so, I mean, the goal of DoorDash is to connect every local business with every local consumer. And the asset we wanted to start with was this logistics network. We have some other ones that we're working on, but this is the one that we always wanted to work on. So in order to achieve highest quality, lowest cost, you need the highest order density. And so restaurant delivery to us was the only, actually it wasn't even one of N, it was one of one in terms of the network that you needed to build to get right.
Great. Let's take some questions. Just raise your hand. There's one in front. They'll bring a microphone to you.
Hi, thank you. One quick question. What did you view as your moat in the early phase of your company for others to not do exactly the same thing with the order density and all the different cities that you're not ready to go in?
There isn't one. I mean, I think the concept of moat is very academic and great. You know, if you're, I don't know, for students in a classroom or something, or writing a paper, but it doesn't, you know, help you as an operator, you know, make any decisions, right? And this is what I mean by, I think no startup, you know, from day one should be thinking about moats in the sense that you're going to somehow build one in a year or two. It's going to take many years. It's important to know where it is. So end game is very important. That's where the moat comes in. And that's why we did restaurant delivery, for example, because we knew that we were going to do all these other categories, and you need the lowest cost structure, so that was important. But how you get there, right, there's no moat on day one for anyone, for any company. That's the good news. And so your job is to figure out what's the next position in the game in order to get to the moat. But this idea that you're going to get to the moat is not, in my opinion, a productive exercise.
Question, Vinod?
So, Tony, I just want to emphasize something you said. You said you do 20 to 25 background checks.
Yeah.
I suspect most people here do 2 or 3 off the list that recruiters gave them, and you said they're off.
They're all blind, yeah.
All blind. I just can't emphasize this enough and add 1 or 2 other things. One, I always say do reference checks with people who somebody worked for, their peers, and people who work for them.
Yes.
You mentioned 360 degree.
Yes.
360 degree means checks at all 3 levels.
Yes.
And across multiple jobs.
And skip levels are actually the most important, because if one of the things you want to test for is, can this leader, at DoorDash, every leader needs to be high-low, meaning they know the strategy, the end game, but they know how the details work on this particular order all the way. And the only way to test for that in a larger organization is the skip levels and the individual contributors on projects, because they know how helpful or not helpful the leader was. Because the leader is probably 3 levels removed if you're thinking about a large tech company that you guys are, or maybe non-tech, but large company that you're recruiting from. And, but it takes a lot of homework. You're almost like an investigative journalist in which you're trying to be that detective to find all of these people.
And I just want to emphasize, many of you have heard me say, the team you build is the company you build, not the plan you make. And that's why these 25 checks are so important. And my bet is 90% of you don't need to even do 10, do less than 10. And I would bet half of you let a recruiter do those checks for you. So I just can't emphasize this enough, because if the team you build is the company you build, this becomes such a critical sort of variable. I just wanted to add to it and emphasize something, that you do that many checks and you look for 360 views. So both are really critical things to emphasize.
By the way, I think Tony is the only CEO I've ever met who actually spent 50% of his time recruiting. Like, people raise their... That doesn't surprise me. But like, literally, people say it's the most important priority, but if you look at a CEO's calendar, it's almost never true. So he's literally the only person I know that is actually true of. Okay, other questions?
So DoorDash, pretty operationally heavy company. At some point, you've had to bring on execs, leaders that are great at process. How do you manage that culture shift? How do you keep the agility and the culture of just getting shit done right away?
Yeah. I don't start with the assumption that they have to be at odds. By and large, you're right. There are organizations. Accounting comes to mind. Compliance is another that comes to mind, where perfect process is what you're optimizing for. But scaling, I don't know, our product team or scaling our engineering team, I'm not necessarily looking for a leader who's going to be perfect at process. I am looking for the person who can innovate at scale. And think about all the things that they've done in their past, and as well as how well they would fit into our system or orchestra of players to actually be able to continue doing that. And it's not just about the leader. You're going to realize very quickly as you scale, it's everything from how easy is it to build products inside your company, technically. What are the management incentives? Managing for innovation versus managing for the core business are going to be very, very different. If you get all of those component parts right, and you have a leader who generally, everyone on the team will say is a material upgrade to the team, and they feel very culturally aligned, I think you're going to be in a good spot.
Whoever gets the microphone first. Yeah, go.
Tony, you mentioned the role of a president, which can sometimes be confounding. And, I guess, how did you know that was the right org structure for you? How do you view that as kind of complementary to what you do? And kind of what are the market differences between maybe your president role and COO, CFO, kind of other key execs?
Yeah, I think I think the names are very minor, and the major is what are the jobs to be done, right? When Christopher joined our company in 2016, actually, thanks to an intro from Vinod, he was just better than me as an operator. So his job was to run the company. My job was just to make sure that he can do that in the most successful way. And actually, probably one of the earliest lessons I learned from Christopher is just how you as the founder, and if you were the one running the company, so the founder CEO, have such information asymmetry with even someone as experienced as Christopher. And we started with Christopher with every function but product and engineering, and then we, in 30 days, took all of that down to just one function for him to run, which was our core team, which was our general managers of cities. Because there was such information asymmetry. But as I watched him, and he came to me with that insight, I didn't come up with that. But as I watched him, over that year, and then every 6 months adding functions and how he was making everything better, it was very obvious to me what his job should have been. It was, if we can find people like that, you just got to get out the way and let that person, do her thing.
Cool. We'll take 2 more questions.
If I just can add to Tony again.
Great.
Tony said to me about Chris specifically, he's a great 0 to 1 player. And I see many companies that don't recognize the difference between 0 to 1 and 1 to 10. And so who you have on your team doing what is really a very nuanced thing that people don't quite understand. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, so we move people around a lot at the company because my job on career longevity or something has way less to do with fancy equity awards and clever ways to tie someone up. It's much more to do with, are we always making sure you're working on the most important problem where you individually can have the most impact? That's going to be by far the best career motivator for you, way more than anything I can do on just purely financially. And so for Christopher, one of the other things I got wrong about, one of the things I got wrong about him in my assessment early on was even though his resume read big company, big company, big company, his spike was actually solving 0 to 1 problems. And so I constantly moved him, probably every 6, 9 months. And then I started taking that same management technique with everyone else. That takes a lot of work, though. It takes a lot of accounting. You have to keep lots of things in track. And probably I did this even up to 1,500 people. I was able to keep everyone in track, in place. But then it got a little bit harder, especially through the pandemic. We weren't always, in person and et cetera. We were more co-located around the world. And so now I have some other mechanisms I use to do this, but we still try to move people. Maybe it's not every 6 months anymore, but every 2 or 3 years, we still are. We're just trying to move them into the role that we think best matches their superpower.
Okay, one more question.
Hi, Tony. Sorry, I'm here. Once you have a really nice, stable business like you guys have, how do you think about new disruptive technologies like robotics, as an example, and introducing that back into the lifeblood of the company?
Yeah, we never think we have a stable business. So let me start with that. And so take something like. There's many in our core restaurant business. We now have 5 businesses. So in each business, I can call out what the disruptive things are. So we tend to try to do it to ourselves first. That's the main thing that we're always trying to do. And so one example, whether it's robotics, whether it's restaurants will deliver themselves, whether it's anything that will basically add some big change to how our business is going to work. We almost always are the first to ship that product. And that's something we're always constantly trying to do. It doesn't mean it's always right, by the way. It doesn't mean it always works. It doesn't mean that we're just a believer in whatever the trend is of the time. But you will always see us as the first people to work with that, whatever that change is. And it's not always a technology change. Sometimes it's a business model change. Sometimes it's something else. But we will always be the first.
Great. With that, thank you very much, Tony. Thanks.